You're listening to the Meet the Farmers podcast with me, your host, Ben Eagle. Please remember to subscribe to the show wherever you are listening. Hello everyone and welcome to episode 256 of Meet the Farmers with me, Ben Eagle. It's our final look through the Meet the Farmers archive this week before we return to some new farmer interviews from next week. First up today, we have Helen Browning, who featured in episode 37 of the show back in June 2019. Hello everyone and welcome to the show. This is episode 37 of Meet the Farmers. We're heading west this time to Wiltshire, where I went to speak to mixed farmer and chief executive of the Soil Association, Helen Browning. Helen took on her family's 1,400-acre mixed farm, which is rented from the Church of England, from her father in the mid-1980s and has since made the farm organic, as well as founding Eastbrook Farm Organic Meats and the Helen Browning Organic brand. If that wasn't enough, she's also taken on the village pub, which she runs with her partner Tim. It's called the Royal Oak at Bishopston. It's really worth checking out. I had my lunch there on the day. The farm has also recently started an agroforestry project. In the past, Helen's been Director of External Affairs at the National Trust, and for 14 years she chaired the Food Ethics Council. The Soil Association has been key in her life, and she was a trustee from 1993 to 2003, chair from 1997 to 2002, and was appointed its chief executive in October 2010. Helen was awarded an OBE in 1998 for her services to organic farming. So without further ado, let's head over to Helen. Helen, thank you so much for speaking to me today. I know you're incredibly busy. What I want to start with is what I saw on your website when you go on straight away, live for today, farm for tomorrow, which is, it's one of those phrases that my grandfather used to say it all the time. It was very much his go-to way that he farmed and way he lived. What does that mean to you?
Well, I think, as you say, it's a saying that's resonating through our lives as farmers. For me, it resonates because I think there is something about that really long-term view that you have to take in farming when you're thinking about the land and you're thinking about, as we're doing here, planting loads and loads of trees that we won't even see come to maturity. Yeah. That responsibility for the next generation, for the generation after that, which should be right at the heart of the farming ethos. And yet the joy we need to take in every day that we have on this earth, and the fun we need to have in doing the good things for the long term. And as a sort of organisation here, I guess that's very much the way we live it. We want to give huge pleasure to people who come here to walk the farm or come to the pub and stay with us or eat our products. Life has got to be, while we're saving the planet, we've got to have fun. And I think appreciating this extraordinary world and allowing ourselves to enjoy it whilst we do the right thing in the long term feels like the way, in many ways, the whole environmental and farming movement needs to go.
Tell me about the farm here at Eastbrook. You're a mixed farm. Tell me about your various enterprises very briefly.
Okay, so we now have, as of this spring, 2 dairy herds, one autumn calving down in the village here, one spring calving herd up at the Downs, a new herd. We rear all the calves from those 2 herds for beef or for heifer replacements. And then we grow some arable crops, slightly less than we used to, spelt mostly now, wheat, barley and oats. We have our famous saddleback sows, British saddleback sows, about 200 sows rearing about 3,500 or 4,000 pigs each year, all outdoors, all organic, of course. My daughter has, and her husband, a sheep flock of about 1,000 Romney ewes. And then our latest venture is agroforestry. We're planting lots of fruits, nuts, biomass, timber trees, experimenting and also trying to do some things that we hope will work commercially, but obviously there's quite a long lead time between planting trees and starting to harvest them, and lots of barriers and challenges along the way, but that's a real passion of mine. So yeah, we're doing lots of stuff here on the farming side, and then as you mentioned, we're also selling those products to people through supermarkets and other retailers, and doing the hospitality thing with the pub and the Chop House, a restaurant in Swindon.
You mentioned your agroforestry. What are your soils, and was that decision to go into agroforestry driven by soil or driven by other factors?
So the farm is long and thin. It's about 5 miles long and half a mile wide. So we run from really light soils on the very top of the downs, really high organic matter soils on the downs, on the chalk, and then down across silty clay loams over chalk, down to the village. And then once we get below the village, we're getting on to increasingly heavy clay soils. So where we've planted the agroforestry is on the very heavy clay, very wet ground at the bottom of the farm, on a bit of land that actually I now own, which means I can do these things, which is harder to do on rented land. And so we are experimenting with what will thrive on those very heavy and quite wet clay soils.
In researching for this episode, I listened to your Desert Island Discs episode with Kirsty Young. In that, discussed your 5 great aunts.
Yes.
Tell me about them.
Oh, they were amazing. A lot of my ancestry seemed to hail from the Red Marley, Ledbury kind of area. Mm-hmm. And the 5 aunts lived at Park Farm, Red Marley, and they were spinsters. My grandfather was one of 11, 2 boys and 9 girls, and 5 of the girls farmed together there until they all popped their clogs some 20 years ago. And as children, we went there very often, and I just loved the life they were leading. Yeah. It felt to me as though they had that sort of independence that I, at the time as a child, wasn't seeing that women really had. So the fact that they were going to market and they were farming and making dairy products and drinking whiskey and basically having what seemed to be a really good time. Yeah. And there was a great spirit. They had great energy and enthusiasm for life. And they lived in this wonderfly ramshackle large house, which my mother, was horrified at because it had none of the mod cons. They didn't have any of that. But it was just a more stripped away lifestyle, but independent. And they were inspirational women, all very different. And all playing very different roles within the farm there. But I loved what they did. I loved them. And I guess it was part of my early inspiration that, I could go and farm and live a independent life, which was one of my early motivations. Yeah,
clearly they were a big influence. I assume your father was also an influence on you. Anybody else as well?
My father was a big influence in that, it was amazing to be able to tag along behind him as I was growing up. And he was, unlike many male farmers, was actually very enthused and supportive of the idea that I wanted to farm. It's always hard to know who were your heroes or sort of influences. I think coming into contact with the organic movement more widely and meeting, one of the reasons I've been so enthused about organic farming, not only about the system itself, but about the people and remarkable entrepreneurial people who have broken the mould, actually, in many ways. So, people like Peter Seger and Dougal Campbell and Bill Starling and Patrick Holden. There were all these kind of great people that I started to spend time with in the sort of late 80s and early 90s, and just found a whole community of people who were doing really different stuff.
While we're talking about your great aunts, I want to stick on women in ag. We're at a time now where we have you leading the Soil Association, we have Minette Batters leading NFU as well. Is this an optimistic time for women in ag?
Yeah, I think it is. I think that the barriers are breaking down. I think we've got many more role models around. When I started doing it, I felt like a bit of a freak show, and now that's very different. I think there are many more women running their own farming businesses and doing it very well. I think women have always been involved in farming, but they just never took the credit for it. They were often doing all of the management behind the scenes. But I think women are coming into their own. I still think there is a need for more on the practical front, and I particularly would like to see more women coming into professional farm management. You've got some people who are lucky enough to run their own farms, as I do, but very few people who are managing farms for other people as a career. So I think there's still much more to do. But I really welcome, I think women bring a different perspective into the mix. That's not saying that, you can never be binary about these things, but I think that you're seeing both more women in farming, but you're seeing particularly a lot more women in the environmental movement too. If you look at the number of women that are heading up the bigger environmental NGOs, that's really remarkable too now. So I think getting a bit more influence in all quarters, but I think again there needs, I'm keen to encourage more through.
You went through quite a difficult period of your life when your brother died at a fairly early age, soon after he got married, and you then went to Australia, among other experiences as well. Tell me about that period in terms of how formative that was.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, having something really dreadful happen to you, I was 18 when Philip died, in some ways makes you bolder. Because you realise that A, life is very short, you just don't know when it's going to stop, and B, when something really bad has happened, it takes away a bit of the fear. Nothing could be as bad as that. So a lot of the things that you might worry about, your self-consciousness or your, fear of failure or whatever, I certainly found that experience was just a real wake-up call to make the most of every moment you have and do the best you can with what you've got. So, yeah, it was...
live for today.
It is. I think, you just don't know what's around the corner. And in a way, I think, say having something so dreadful happen so early just meant that I've decided not to waste a moment or an opportunity if I possibly can. Those things that happen in families are, deeply difficult. And I think, like a lot of people who've been through that sort of thing, I had a period of real depression for a period of time, and I needed to run away, and I did run away. And actually, getting off to Australia was in itself, a really good experience, not because it was particularly enjoyable for big chunks of it, but actually that standing on your own 2 feet at 19 and being in a completely different country without a support base really gave me confidence that I could look after myself. So having those adventures was I think quite an important thing in terms of developing my own resilience.
It's one of those things actually about travelling alone, isn't it, as well? It's very easy to look back on an experience with a good light, but actually it's the challenging times that are important in life. But when you travel and you're completely self-reliant, I think actually there are quite, having think about it now, there's quite a lot of reflections actually between coping by yourself travelling and coping on a farm.
Yeah.
Anyways.
And coping
that sense of self-reliance.
Yeah. Absolutely. I spent quite a long time. I bought a van and travelled around a lot of Australia, worked periodically in different places, and was travelling solo for the vast majority of the time. And you have to kind of start to read what's going on around you, try and make sure you're keeping yourself safe, and cope with your own company. I think it was a really formative period of time, and probably put me in a position where I was able to take on this place also quite young without completely blowing up.
And you knew for a long time that you wanted to go into farming. You went to Harper Adams to do a degree in agricultural technology. As part of that, and we were chatting before we started recording about Barry Wookey.
Yeah.
His book on his farm is one that had a big influence on me. And your work is referenced in that. With ADAS, which is the successor of the National Agricultural Advisory Service. Tell me about that time and perhaps how because I think you were comparing Barry's organic fields with neighbouring conventional fields as well, and you're looking at a whole range of different criteria. How did that shape the way you thought?
Well, that was hugely formative because I was starting to get interested in organic ideas while I was doing my degree, and this opportunity came up to become the research student on the first, as it was, Ministry of Agriculture then, funded piece of research on organic farming. And as you say, we were comparing matched fields, organic and neighbouring conventional farms, for a whole range of parameters. So we were looking at things like weed populations, earthworm populations, yields, disease levels, some of the finances.
Yeah, the economics as well.
Nitrate leaching, looking at the leakage of nitrates from different farming systems. Loads of stuff. And it was an amazing experience because I learnt more in that year about farming and about organic farming than I would ever have learnt from another 10 years at Harper Adams, to be perfectly honest, because it was I had to really understand the life cycle of the various pests and the carbon cycle and nitrogen cycles, and it gave me the sort of building blocks in many ways that allowed me then to come back here and start to try and put together an organic farming system when there was less advice and support than there is now, in order to sort of try and make that happen. So yeah, it was a really, really helpful year. The farm is largely up on the edge of Salisbury Plain, so freezing cold in the winter. Sort of, I remember spending a lot of time augering soils through the permafrost, but really fascinating. Learned a lot about things like earthworms and stuff. Some of the stuff I've probably forgotten now, but it was a great year.
When did you begin the organic conversion here at Eastbrook, and how did that go down?
So actually, we converted one field before I came back to the farm, because one of my obsessions was phosphate release from different soil types. One of the challenges within organic farming or any farming system is that recycling of phosphate. As part of my final degree project, I was doing some work on phosphate release from calcareous soils. So I converted one of the fields here to continue some of the work that I'd started on a research front. I'd always been really interested in research and still am. And so when I came back here in 86, having finished my degree, I had a 20-acre field that was already converted. And we started then running trials on different types of farming enterprise to see what we might do on the farm as a whole. The conversion of the whole farm started in earnest the next year in 87, and we basically converted about 200 acres a year as it came into the lay phase of the rotation over the next 6 years. And at that time, there was no support, no financial support for going organic, so we had to make sure that the cash flow for the whole farm would work.
Especially as a farm tenant as well.
Especially as a tenant. So we started it in earnest in 87 and finished in 94.
You're perhaps particularly well known for your work with pigs. For listeners who don't know, what are the key differences between an organic pig unit and a more conventional system?
Well, obviously, conventional pig units take many forms, but on the organic front, they're outside all their lives, so you're breeding and finishing outside. We're not weaning the piglets until they're at least 8 weeks old, so a lot longer than they would stay with their mums in a conventional system. We're not allowed to teeth cut or tail dock or nose ring, so there's sort of much lower mutilations, and they're fed obviously an organic diet, and they have to have forage in their diet as well, so even if the paddocks are a bit bare during the winter, you're supplying forage as well. So it's a very different sort of free range life for an organic pig, and the health status tends to be very high because they're not stressed, and they're getting plenty of fresh air. So it's a system that here we fold them across a lot of land over the years. So every time a sow farrows, she's farrowing on a clean block of land that hasn't had pigs on it for 7 or 8 years, and every time they're weaned, they're going onto another block of land. So it's a system that rolls around the farm and provides lots of fertility for arable cropping afterwards. So it really is a system that's integrated within that wider farming system.
Why do you like working with pigs so much?
I didn't grow up with any experience of pigs at all here. We never kept pigs here. So that really was born out of my experience at Harper, where when I was, we were given a project by our lecturer there. First of all, he took us to all these kind of supposedly state-of-the-art pig and poultry units, and they were like something out of hell as far as I was concerned. And I thought, if that's the future, if that's the way we're going to keep our farm animals in the future, I want no part of it. So one of the seeds that was sown then was the idea that I would want to champion high welfare ways of keeping particularly pigs and poultry, because they are our most abused animal. I think, beef and sheep in this country are largely still free range, but pigs and chickens have a pretty hideous time. And in the 80s, they were probably almost at their worst. I think we've improved some of our conventional farming systems since then. So it was a bit of I want to have a crack at this. So when I came back here, I very quickly bought a couple of gilts in pig gilts, and farrowed them down and started getting some practical experience in pig keeping. And it kind of grew from there, very slowly initially. We sort of learnt as we went and started developing products and that kind of thing. Pigs are good from a number of points of view. I mean, they're the most abused animals, so actually doing something about them felt like a good thing to do. But also you can use all of the pig very easily. You make so many great products from pigs, and products that everybody likes to eat. So actually it's much easier to build a marketing business on pork than it is on beef, for instance, because you can make your bacon and sausages and, rillette and lardons and all these things that people eat, whereas actually with beef it's much harder, or with lamb it's much harder to find the added value opportunities that there are through pork.
The point's been made quite a bit regularly that eating food is an ethical minefield in many ways, especially at the moment with various movements going on. You chaired the Food Ethics Council, and you're still involved.
Yeah.
Tell me about the Food Ethics Council, what its aims are, what it's trying to achieve.
As you can tell, because I've been involved for so long, I've been such a fan of the Food Ethics Council for many moons. It's a small charity, but it really helps us to think through what should we do, all things considered. So really trying to give people the tools to think through some of these really thorny areas, what we should be doing and how. Because sometimes it's very easy to jump to a knee-jerk, where perhaps to be in the media this week is the immediate answer. Everybody sort of dives off down a certain road. And the FEC stands back and says, OK, let's look at this from every perspective, from obviously a humanities perspective, but also taking into account farm animals or, the wildlife or people in different communities, and try and make sure that when we're making a judgment call about what's the right thing to do, that we've taken all those perspectives fully into account, that we've looked at this in a sort of balanced way. And I really like the rigour of that kind of thinking. I think we need to have food systems, in fact everything, with ethics at their heart. We need to be encouraging people to be doing things for the right reasons. And I think that some tools to help us think through things objectively is such a helpful discipline.
Then there's the Soil Association.
Yeah.
How did you first become involved, and did you expect to become so deeply involved?
I never expect anything. One sort of rambles through life and things happen. But I think, so I became involved with the Soil Association quite early on, initially as a licensee, of course. Yeah. And that's how I first bumped into them, really. And then I got involved with British Organic Farmers, which was a farmer organic support group, really, and chaired that in the early 90s, and then worked to bring the British Organic Farmers and the Organic Growers Association, which had been sort of offshoots of the Soil Association, back together again. We just don't need constant splintering. So I then became a trustee of the Soil Association and, as you know, chair a few years later. And then left and then came back again as a member of staff initially, as a food and farming director, and then left again and then came back as chief exec. So I can't seem to quite leave the Soil Association 30 years on, and keep doing things in different guises. And I guess one of the reasons for that is that I love the breadth of what the Soil Association is doing, that whole understanding of, the health of soil, plant, animal, man, that kind of real deep philosophy right at our core. And the fact that we are, I think, walking an interesting line between trying to get the environment right, the animal welfare right, the biodiversity right, the farming economics right, and that you understanding that we need to be working on all those things at once rather than just trying to pick off the odd silo here and there. So I think that for me, the philosophy of trying to make sure that you're developing solutions that meet a multiple of objectives rather than just becoming very focused on one. It's much easier to explain to people what you're doing if you're just saying, oh, we're saving the panda or whatever it might be. But if you're trying to sort out climate change, the biodiversity crash, obesity and malnutrition, animal welfare and antibiotic over-reliance, nutrient pollution, you end up with a different basket of solutions than you would do if you were just looking at climate change or just looking at animal welfare. So I think that that breadth, that holistic approach really appeals to me. And the fact that we're working with a really broad community of people, from dinner ladies to foresters to farmers and growers and politicians. And, I think that we need that holistic thinking to be a much bigger part of the mix. And the Soil Association does that in spades.
Was Helen Browning, and again, if you want to listen to that whole episode, head back to episode 37. Next up is Suffolk arable farmer Edward Vipond, who was in episode 135 in December 2021. Hello and welcome to episode 135 of the Meet the Farmers podcast. I'm your host, Ben Eagle, and today I'm heading over the county border to Suffolk to speak to arable farmer and winner of both the Farm Manager of the Year category at this year's Farmers Weekly Awards, as well as the overall Farmer of the Year award. Edward Vipond manages Truston Farms, which is made up of 4 holdings and around 1,500 hectares. Cropping is varied and includes, among other things, milling and feed wheat, bolting and feed barley, milling and feed rye, spring beans, sunflowers, and maize for anaerobic digestion. It is a real privilege today to find out more about the man behind this clearly successful farm business. Edward, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you very much, Ben. Good to be here.
Really, really good to have you. Before we talk about you, tell us a bit more about Truston Farms and your part of Suffolk.
Yeah, so Truston Farms has been in existence since 1961. When Helmet class bought the farm, which was only 1,000 acres, 400 hectares at that point. And a lot has changed since 1961. And poor old Helmet, he's no longer with us. He died last year.
Oh, okay.
He very visionary character and an amazing man to meet on a number of occasions. Yeah. But his daughter now, Katrina Class, Mulhauser, she's my boss effectively, and she has expanded the business significantly since about 2012. Things started to really kick off. I wasn't here then. I've been here 6 years.
Okay,
and things started to increase at that point. But we're now farming, as you said, just around a little over 1,500 hectares, spread over 24 miles from land that will blow away in a good strong March wind to land that won't blow anywhere.
Yeah.
So from Suffolk sort of boulder clay to Breckland sand and everything in between. And wow. That's a challenge.
I was going to say, yeah, quite a challenge. And sort of turning back the clock, you grew up still in Suffolk on a 100-acre farm near to me in the Essex border. Yes. Take me back to your childhood.
Okay, so born at a farm near Floaton, not far from Hadley, and we then moved to another farm, again just a little bigger, just over 100 acres, in Wicker Street Green between Boxford and Kersey. 100 acres, lovely house. Clearly, our parents couldn't sustain their living on 100 acres, and felt that it was the right thing to do to sell the farm, which kind of shattered my dreams somewhat.
Okay.
But they were slightly rose-tinted spectacle dreams with 100 acres. But we sold the farm when I was 16 and moved to Scotland.
Yeah.
But farming was always just, that was whatever else I was going to do. Farming was going to be number one priority, and probably my GCSE results gave a very good picture of what I wasn't doing as opposed to what I was doing, which is sat on a tractor.
Okay.
But anyway, there we are. I mean, it was what I wanted to do, and that was my passion. So, yeah, we moved when I was 16 to Scotland to buy a bigger farm. That was the plan.
Okay.
We were one of the so-called white settlers to move north, and you could buy an awful lot more land in Scotland in the early 80s for 100 acres in Suffolk.
Yeah.
But that didn't come off, unfortunately. My father ended up buying a country clothing and fishing tackle shop, which was, I suppose, an early form of diversification.
Yeah.
And good for him, because it made good money on the River Tweed in Kelso. And gave me a bit of a crossroads, I suppose, as to what I was going to do. Was I going to go into the retail industry and help in the shop, or was I going to follow my real desire to farm? And it was a pretty easy choice. So when we moved to Scotland, I became a YTS trainee. Would you believe? Okay. Earning the princely sum of $29.50 a week, which seems a bit strange now, but it was where it started. And I worked on a 1,000-acre, very traditional 1,000-acre livestock and arable farm in the Scottish borders. What ended up being for 3 years, 2 years as a YTS trainee. And then a year on a full wage, which I felt I was a millionaire at that point, having earned $29.50 a week. But taught me an awful lot. A very nice farming family I worked for, and they gave me a really good grounding in what was to me at that point large-scale arable farming and livestock farming.
Yeah. Beautiful part of the world up in the borders as well.
Stunning. Yeah,
absolutely.
Stunning.
Yeah. And I mean, you did a diploma in ag at Moulton College. Why there? I think there's some family history, isn't there?
Family history, yeah. I was the third generation to go to Moulton. It was a family sort of link, and I felt very strongly I wanted to do that. And it was a good college, and still is a very good college. Has had to diversify into all sorts of other things other than agriculture. But at the time I was there, agriculture was still a very important part, and it still is. But they've had to look elsewhere to keep the college viable. So yes, an NDA ultimately at National Diploma in Agriculture at Moulton, which that was my focus, and I excelled in that, and really revelled in college life and everything that entails.
Yeah,
and then moved and didn't do a degree, went and did a postgrad at Aberdeen University. Right. Bit of a jump in academic terms, but from a diploma in agriculture to a postgrad in farm business management, which was a very, very hard course, a year postgrad course at Aberdeen SAC, and loved it, really loved it. And came out of having passed that with another big crossroads as to what I did next, really.
Absolutely. And then I mean, you eventually ended up at Velcor, and you spent 14 years there. What were your learning points during that time? Take us through those years.
They kind of ripped the rule book up of everything I learned at college. Not quite, but most of it was start from scratch, and it was a different mindset. And they taught me an awful lot about business management, crop management, personnel management. And at the time, there was a training scheme, which I eventually got onto, farm management training scheme. And I spent 2 years being trained by some very high caliber guys in the company. And then became farm manager after a few years and moved a number of times. That's putting it mildly. If you wanted to progress in Velcor, you had to move, and I moved a lot. And spent 14 very happy years managing very diverse businesses, from growing cauliflowers and calabrese in Lincolnshire to broad-scale, high-yielding land in Kent.
Wow. I always find that sort of moving about, and I've had this conversation with foresters before, who by the nature of their job, that they move about a lot. How did you find that, I suppose, socially and with other parts of your life, moving about that much?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't easy, and I think when you become married and kids come along, it becomes even more complicated and difficult.
Yeah, exactly.
I sort of was at the end of my time with Velcor when that did happen, and it's a big issue, and I think the way I looked at it was I wanted to get to a certain level. If you wanted to progress, you had to move.
Let's talk about your Nuffield scholarship. Why did you decide to do one of those?
Well, I sat at my desk one evening in Dover, actually, when I was farm manager down in Kent, and my farms director at the time just popped in to see me and just left on the desk a Nuffield scholarship leaflet, and I thought,
right,
far too busy. I haven't got time for that. Yeah. And then I spoke to a guy called John Stones, who was at that point the director of Nuffield, who was the most persuasive man I've ever met. Okay. And ended up persuading me that it was a good idea, and I had got time, and Velcor wouldn't mind me leaving the farm for what ended up being 6 weeks in the States, a month in Australia, and quite a lot of time in Europe.
Wow.
And I ended up studying precision agriculture, which at the time was incredibly new in the farming world. And in 80, now hang on, let's get this right, 93, 94 it was, I did the scholarship.
Okay.
Precision ag and anything it involved was fairly new. And I had the most amazing time. And I have to say, I went to the Nuffield conference just recently this year. And I was quite happy to say to people that it changed me as a person.
Yeah.
It made me more confident. It made me think about the challenges that we face, and gave me a different perception of risk as well in farming terms. In that, we feel, we're rather cocooned, and we can feel rather cocooned in the UK. And we'll come on to talk about it, I'm sure. But what we're about to experience in the next 7 or 8 years takes risks to a different level in the UK agriculture. So what I learned at Nuffield was, there's guys in Australia and certainly in when I went to Western Australia in Perth, they look at risk totally different to us, and the way they handle it and the way they deal with it is totally different. That taught me a lot.
Okay, fascinating. Is your report still available online?
It is, yeah, it is indeed. It's titled "Precision Farming: Practical Toy or Expensive Tool," it's still there. A lot has changed in the precision ag world since that report was written, but it certainly gave me an inkling and an insight into what is still some of it cutting edge technology.
Interesting. So after Velcourt, you moved to the Cotswolds for a time. And you ran an estate there. What was that like?
That was diverse with a capital D, I think. So I'd put that. It ended up being 2 estates in Scotland, and 2 estates in Gloucestershire.
Oh, wow.
But very, very hands-off on the ones in Scotland, but certainly hands-on on the ones in Gloucestershire. We ended up building an anaerobic digester, and that ended up being a 2-megawatt plant. Started off growing crops for the feedstock, and ended up doing a deal with, I can still remember going to Caerphilly and doing a deal with the Peters Food Service, as they're called, which is a pastry and pie manufacturer, for their waste. So we ended up feeding it food waste and everything that entails, including pasteurisation and such things. But that was a very diverse estate with a very hands-on owner who was tenacious and really wanted to drive the estate forward. Building the AD plant and then subsequently spreading all the digestate on the land with everything that entails, improving yields dramatically on the estate, in Cotswold Brash, and farming up to nearly 1,000 feet. Yeah, a challenge in itself. We had a fairly big residential portfolio of houses, a very nice pheasant and partridge shoot, and the farm. So I felt that Suffolk was the place that I wanted to head back to.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm not surprised all that. It's a very, very, very busy life. So eventually you ended up back where your life began in Suffolk, at Troston. What appealed to you about the job that you're now in?
So a result of, I suppose, in some respects, being micromanaged in Gloucestershire, and the reporting schedule to the landowner was quite intense. Whereas in Suffolk, I have a far greater amount of autonomy, and I will see my landowner. Well, I used to see my landowner in Gloucestershire 3 or 4 times a day, whereas I see Katrina maybe 3 or 4 times a year. So that is the difference. Not that I don't. The autonomy I have here is I suppose the analogy I'd use is as close as I'll ever get to owning my own farm.
Yep.
And farming for me is very personal. And there is nothing worse than making a mistake in agriculture, because you can hide your mistakes in many fields or many industries, but farming usually isn't one of them, and it's usually by the road. So having autonomy, having the responsibility and the ability to drive the farm in the direction I want is incredibly important to me, and I don't take that for granted in any way, shape, or form. It's there is obviously a huge responsibility with that, but that I don't mind. But the ability to shape the farm and change things as I see fit with the board approval is great.
And again, just a taster of that episode with Edward Vipond, who is in episode 135. That's it for another archive episode. Next week, we'll be back on track with some new farmers, and I'll be joined by dairy farmer Patrick Holden, who farms in Ceredigion and is also the founder and CEO of the Sustainable Food Trust. I hope you can join me then, but until then, have a great week ahead.